My name is Ezra Whitmore. I am 55 years old, and I was born in the heart of the American South in Charleston, South Carolina, a city marked by its traditions, its history, and above all, by faith. I grew up in a deeply Christian family, where prayer was as natural as breathing. My mother, a woman of unshakable faith, was the first to teach me to bend my knees. From a very young age, my routine began and ended with a conversation with God. When I woke up, I would give thanks for life. At night, I would ask for protection for myself and my loved ones. And so I continued for decades, repeating this ritual like brushing my teeth or drinking coffee, without questioning it, without overthinking it. Throughout my youth and most of my adult life, this faith was the backbone of my existence. I attended church every Sunday, helped out at community events, read the Bible regularly, and tried to live by its teachings. I honestly thought that was enough. I was doing everything right. I was a model Christian, or so I like to think. I worked as an accountant for over 30 years. I married Abigail, my high school sweetheart, and together we built a stable and peaceful life. We had 2 wonderful children, bought a charming home on the outskirts of town, and became active in our local church. In the eyes of others, we were an example of a Christian family, and I was proud of that. I was proud of the reputation we had, the life we led, as if all of this were proof that we were on the right path to heaven. But the truth is that deep down, there was a quiet arrogance inside me, a kind of pride disguised as devotion. Without realizing it, I began to judge those who did not follow in my footsteps. Those who did not go to church, who lived differently, were, unconsciously, less to me, less committed to God, less worthy of salvation. I didn't say it out loud, of course. Maybe I didn't even admit it to myself, but that's what I felt, as if I was somehow on a higher spiritual level. This, I realized today, was one of the most insidious sins, spiritual pride. I've never been one to believe in a literal hell of fire and brimstone. To me, those images always seemed more like metaphors than realities. Something used to teach lessons, not to describe destinies. I saw myself as far removed from all that. After all, I followed the rules, didn't I? I prayed, I read the Bible, I loved my family. In my mind, that was enough. But life, or perhaps God, has a curious way of putting us in our place. And it was on a day that should have been one of joy and celebration that everything changed. It was a summer Saturday, one of those days that seems tailor-made for a fairy tale. The sky was so blue it was dazzling, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of newly bloomed flowers. I woke up excited. That day would be special, the wedding of Mark, my childhood friend. We grew up together, attended the same services, and laughed together at church retreats. Now, he was about to marry the woman he loved. I arrived early for the ceremony, which was to be held outdoors in a lovely garden on the outskirts of the city. I helped with the final preparations. I arranged some chairs and lined up the petals on the path where the bride and groom would walk. Everything looked perfect. The green lawn, the impeccably lined up white chairs, the flower arch that served as an altar. Even the breeze seemed to have been sent directly from heaven. During the ceremony, when Mark and his bride exchanged vows, I felt my heart fill with gratitude. I thought about my wife, my children, and the life I had built with so much effort and faith. I silently thanked God for everything He had given me. It was one of those moments when everything seemed to fall into place. After the I do, everyone went to the reception. The atmosphere was cheerful, full of light music, laughter, hugs, and reunions. I walked among the guests, talking to friends I hadn't seen in years, exchanging stories, remembering old times. It was impossible not to feel happy. It was then that I approached the cake table. The cake looked like a hand-sculpted work of art. 4 tall layers of flawless white frosting, decorated with sugar flowers so delicate, they looked freshly plucked from a heavenly garden. It seemed almost sacrilegious to cut it. When the waiter began to serve the slices, I, without hesitation, approached the table and accepted a piece. It was a moment of celebration, of communion, and I confess that not for a second did I think about asking about the ingredients. I have always taken my peanut allergy very seriously. Since childhood, I was taught to read labels as carefully as one reads the Bible. In restaurants, I would often find myself asking waiters and chefs what was in each dish. But there, in that atmosphere of joy and trust, surrounded by fellow believers, I let my guard down. After all, we were at a Christian wedding. Why would there be anything there that could harm me? I took the first bite. It was immediate. At first, I thought it was just the emotion of the moment. A slight tingling in my throat, perhaps from smiling so much, from talking so much. But within a few seconds, that familiar and dreaded feeling began to intensify. An uncomfortable itch, my throat starting to close up, as if an invisible fist was squeezing inside. My heart raced. I tried to stay calm. I thought, it can't be, not here, not today. But it was. I looked around, and suddenly everything seemed to be spinning slowly. The laughter and music became distant echoes, as if I were underwater. I started to look for Abigail, my wife. I wanted to scream her name, but my voice was failing. A barely formed "help" escaped my lips, barely audible. I felt my legs go weak, and before I could understand what was happening, everything around me began to darken. The last image I have is of Abigail's face leaning over me, her eyes wide, frightened, and tears falling silently down my face. She was saying something, but I couldn't hear her anymore. My world was plunged into silence. At that moment, the only thing I could do was pray. God, please, forgive me. I didn't know exactly what sin I was asking forgiveness for. Maybe for everyone. Maybe because I lived an automatic faith, because I felt superior, because I judged, because I forgot about grace. It was a desperate, naked, true plea, the most sincere I've ever made in my life. And then, it was all gone. It wasn't like sleeping. It wasn't like being awake either. It was something else. An existence without form, without weight, without time. There was no ground beneath my feet. In fact, I didn't even know if I still had feet. It was as if my body had disappeared, and all that was left was my consciousness, floating in an immense void. At first, the panic was absolute. I tried to scream, but there was no sound. I tried to move, but there were no muscles to command. It was like being trapped in a dream with no body, no direction, no control. Is this it? I thought. Is this where it all ends? The weather? I don't know. That did not obey the time as we know it. It could have been seconds, hours, or years. There, time did not exist, but little by little something in me began to quiet down. Fear gave way to reflection. I began to remember my life with impressive clarity. They weren't flashes like the movies say. It was deeper. I saw my attitudes, my choices, my silences, my judgments. I felt every moment as if I were living it all over again, but this time through the eyes of truth. It was then that, in the middle of that absolute void, a point of light appeared, tiny at first, so small I thought I was imagining it, but as I focused my attention on it, I noticed it growing larger, or maybe it was me getting closer to it. It was a light unlike any other I had ever seen. It didn't hurt my eyes. It didn't blind me. It was warm, welcoming, and at the same time immense, majestic, as if it contained the entire universe within itself. And then I felt it. I didn't see anyone, but I knew. There was a presence, huge, ineffable. It was as if all reality around me had been swallowed up by something infinitely larger than myself. For the first time in my life, I felt something that I can only describe as the very presence of God. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't with my ears. I no longer had ears. The voice spoke directly to my conscience. It was soft, but at the same time it had a weight that ran through everything. An authority so absolute that it silenced even the last vestige of my ego. "Ezra," said the voice, "it's time to see what you've always denied." At that moment I was overcome with awe. Part of me wanted to retreat, to disappear back into the darkness. But another part, deeper, truer, knew that this was a turning point. Something inside me whispered, "You have to see it." And that's when everything started to change. The light around me began to transform in an almost magical way, as if a new world were being woven before my eyes, or rather, before my consciousness, since my body seemed to no longer exist. Colors and shapes appeared in the void, at first vaguely and fluidly, then with astonishing clarity. It was as if I were being driven, without choice, without direction of my own, by a force that was at once irresistible and absolute. And that's when I saw it. Not an allegory, not a symbolic illustration, but hell, real, cruel, undeniable. I, who had spent my life doubting its literal existence, found myself standing before it, forced to face a reality I never imagined I would witness, let alone experience. If I had still had a physical body, I am certain I would have fainted on the spot. But in that pure state of consciousness, there was no escape. I was completely vulnerable, exposed to that devastating sight. What I saw was beyond any nightmare, any warning sermon. The ground beneath me, if it could even be called a ground, was cracked, burned, vibrating with a suffocating heat, as if each fissure hid an ancient pain. The air, thick as smoke from 1,000 fires, was filled with the smell of sulfur and something worse, despair, a scent that seemed to take root within the soul. All around me, flames danced. They were not like the fire we know. They were alive. They had a will. They writhed like hungry snakes, stretching out as if seeking to touch, to envelop, to consume. They were flames that burned not flesh, but spirit, fire that fed on guilt, on belated regret. And then came the screams, screams that seemed to cross dimensions, coming from all sides at once. They were human voices, yes, but torn apart by pain, by remorse, by the loss of all hope. It was an eternal, continuous, desperate lament, a somber chorus that made any thought of peace impossible. I tried to shield myself from that sound. Instinctively, I wanted to cover my ears, but I had no ears, and the sound, somehow, penetrated directly into my soul, without filter, without relief. It was at that moment, at the height of horror, that something inside me snapped. I turned my gaze, or felt my consciousness being pulled, to a part of that hellish landscape, and what I saw completely disarmed me. In the midst of the flames, I saw faces, familiar faces. Mr. Thompson, the deacon of our church, always so respected, so careful with the scriptures. He stood there, covered in flames, his eyes fixed on something only he could see, an expression of pain that no words could describe. And beside him was Mrs. Jenkins, always present at Sunday services, always smiling. Now her face was a mask of pure suffering, contorted as if it were made of melted wax. I recognized others, many others, people I had prayed with, worshipped with, served in ministries with, people who in my mind were examples of faith. They were there, as if frozen in an eternal state of belated regret. I asked, desperate, how is this possible? These people were good. They lived in the church. They talked about God. It was then that the voice returned, the same voice that enveloped me in that light, that spoke directly to the essence of my being. Ezra, he said with tenderness, but also with sadness, what you see here is not the result of great crimes or obvious evils. What brought these souls here is something more subtle, more insidious: pride. I was confused. Pride, I repeated, still in shock, but these people were humble, servants of God. The answer came like a cold current that passed through my consciousness. The pride of believing that your actions, your prayers, your presence in church were enough to deserve heaven. The pride of silently judging others, of feeling better for fulfilling rituals. The pride of never truly repenting, because deep down, you never believed you needed forgiveness. Those words cut me like a sharp blade, and then, like a terrible mirror, I saw myself. I saw how many times I had done the same thing, how many times I had prayed mechanically, how many times I had gone to church out of habit, how many times I had looked down on those who lived differently. I had always thought I was right, on the right path, but had I ever really sought transformation, or had I merely dressed myself in the guise of holiness? The voice continued, firm but compassionate. See, Ezra, see what pride does to the soul. My attention was then drawn to another group of figures in distress: pastors, spiritual leaders, men and women I knew by name, by fame, by preaching. They were trapped in a torturous cycle, constantly reliving the moments when they could have turned to God in brokenness of heart, but chose the easy way out: self-indulgence, the illusion that they were saved by their own merit. One of them, a renowned preacher whose sermons I had admired in my youth, cried out in heart-rending pain, "I preached about hell, but I never believed it was real. I thought my pretty words, my charitable works would be enough." At that moment I understood, it is not the appearance of faith that saves. It is not the rituals, the positions, the good deeds. It is true repentance, humility before grace. And I was dangerously close to falling into the same trap. Another pastor, someone I knew personally, was crying in the midst of the flames like a lost child. I judged others, he regretted, believing I was better than them. Now I see that my heart was filled with pride and hypocrisy. Every word, every cry was like a blade piercing my soul. I saw in them a reflection of what I was, of what I had become without even realizing it. The image of these men and women, people I had always admired for their faith, now plunged into eternal suffering, forced me to face the truth I had always avoided. I was just like them. My faith, which I had always considered strong and true, was just a shell. It was built on customs, habits, and appearances. I followed the rules, yes, I went to church, yes, I prayed, I read the Bible, I helped with church outreaches, but all of this was done with the confidence of someone who believes they already have heaven guaranteed, and not with a truly broken heart. My faith was automatic, superficial, and empty. Why am I seeing this? I asked, feeling my conscience tremble under the weight of guilt, shame, fear. The answer came with the same firm and gentle clarity as the previous time. So that you can understand, so that you can change. Ezra, you are being given a second chance, a chance to see the truth and choose the right path. At that moment, something inside me snapped. A wave of humility and gratitude washed over me in a way I had never experienced before. I realized how close I had come to being there, among those tormented souls, and not because of any blatant sins, but because of the subtle, silent, and destructive sin of spiritual pride. What should I do? I asked, small before the greatness of God, broken by the truth. The voice responded with a tenderness that could only come from heaven. Times. Return and live in true humility. Seek genuine repentance. Judge not, assume not. Love, serve, and never forget what you have seen. These words weren't just spoken, they were branded into my soul. And then, slowly, the vision began to fade. The flames, the screams, the suffering faces, everything began to dissolve like mist at dawn. But what I felt, it didn't go away. The impact of that was permanently etched on me. The first thing I felt was pain, a sharp pain tearing through my throat as if I had swallowed glass. My eyes slowly opened, blinded by a bright white light. For a moment I was disoriented. Where was the fire? Where were the screams? The smell of sulfur? Little by little, the environment around me began to take shape. I was in a hospital room. The steady, monotonous sound of a heart monitor filled the air. Machines hummed softly around me. I tried to move my arms, but my body felt as heavy as lead. Then I felt something, a hand squeezing mine. I turned my head with effort and saw Abigail. She was there, sitting next to me, her eyes closed in prayer. She was holding my hand so tightly, as if her very soul was connected to mine in that grip. "Abby," I whispered with difficulty, my voice scratching in my throat. Her eyes opened immediately, full of tears, full of love. "Ezra, oh thank God," she exclaimed, rising and leaning over me, wrapping me in a delicate embrace, as if she feared I might fall apart. In the next few minutes, the room filled with doctors and nurses. They took my blood pressure, checked my vital signs, and asked me questions I could barely answer. I discovered that I had suffered a severe anaphylactic reaction. My heart had stopped. There was no heartbeat for several minutes before I was revived. I had been in a coma for 3 days. But as they talked about oxygen, adrenaline, and medical statistics, my mind was elsewhere. What I saw, the hell, the screams, the revelation of the pride that was eating away at my soul, all of it swirled in my head with more reality than the white room around me. Was it real? Was it just a dream? A delirium caused by a lack of oxygen to the brain? I may never have a concrete answer. But when I looked at Abigail, when I saw the love and relief in her eyes, I knew one thing for sure, dream or not, that changed me. Forever. The feeling of having been on the brink of eternal damnation, of having seen the abyss beneath the feet of my comfortable faith, was overwhelming. It didn't matter whether others believed it or not. I knew what I had lived through. "Ezra, are you okay?" Abigail asked, touching my face tenderly, noticing my distant gaze. I swallowed hard. Tears formed in my eyes. "Abby," I muttered, my voice cracking. I saw things. I need to tell you." She squeezed my hand tighter, her eyes now full of concern and affection. "It's okay, honey. You're safe now." But I knew. No, everything was not okay. Nothing would be normal anymore. Nothing would be the same anymore. The words I heard in that light kept echoing within me, like a constant call. Go back and live with true humility. How to describe the indescribable? How could I put into words the profound and silent transformation that had taken place within me? My family listened to me with love, with sincere concern in their eyes. Abigail, my children, my close friends, they all listened to me attentively, but I could see in their eyes a silent doubt, a distance. And how could I blame them? They had not seen what I saw. They had not heard that voice. They had not felt the weight of that judgment, nor the pain of the spiritual flames. The doctors, with their clipboards and clinical explanations, talked about hallucinations induced by cerebral hypoxia, a fancy term for lack of oxygen. They claimed that what I experienced was just a manifestation of the brain dying, a kind of vivid death dream, but I knew with every fiber of my soul that it wasn't. It was too real, too painful, too transformative. What I experienced was not just the awakening from a physical coma. It was the end of a spiritual sleep that lasted my entire life. When I was released from the hospital, I came home with a mission. It wasn't to go around preaching or trying to convince others. No, it was a personal mission. A mission of reconstruction, of purification, of true repentance. For the first time, I wanted to live in a way that actually reflected the faith I had always professed, but never truly embraced. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Decades of pride, of knee-jerk religiosity, of spiritual self-satisfaction wouldn't be undone overnight. But now I saw. For the first time, I saw clearly. Abigail was helping me up the porch steps when I stopped in the doorway. I looked up at the sky, which on that spring morning seemed bluer and higher than ever, and whispered, almost without a voice, "Thanks, not only for the second chance at life, but for the opportunity to live for real." In the days and weeks that followed, I dove into deep introspection. It was as if I had spent my entire life looking at myself through a foggy mirror, and suddenly the glass had been wiped clean. What I saw didn't please me, but it freed me. Every thought, every old behavior was now placed in a new light, a raw, painful, and necessary light. The first challenge was to deal with the shock of realization. For years, decades, I had convinced myself that I was on the right path. I went to church every week, I prayed before meals, I attended events, I tithed. I thought that was faith. I thought that was be saved. But now I saw. It was all surface, appearance, custom. I began to question everything. Every prayer said on autopilot, every act of charity done with the hidden intention of being seen. Every moment of worship lived more as an obligation than as a dedication. Guilt gnawed at me inside. Shame accompanied me in every silence. How could I have been so blind? Abigail noticed. Of course she noticed. One afternoon, as we sat on the porch, she gently touched my hand and said, "Ezra, you haven't been the same since you got back from the hospital. I'm worried about you." I sighed, not knowing where to begin. "Abby, I saw things that made me see how wrong I was. Above all," she frowned, her eyes watering. "Honey, you've been through a trauma. It's natural to feel confused, but you've always been a man of faith. Don't let this destroy your trust in God." Abigail. But that was exactly it. That strong faith that everyone saw in me was part of the problem. It was a proud faith, presumptuous, full of empty certainties. I began to drift away from the church, not because of loss of faith, but because of pain. Every time I walked through the doors of that temple, I saw the faces of those I had seen in hell, brothers and sisters who, like me, thought they were saved just by being there. The hypocrisy, not just theirs but mine, was too painful to bear. Friends began to comment. Some said I was in crisis. Others suggested therapy, psychologists. I even heard an exorcism from a more exalted brother. But no one understood that I was not losing faith. I was trying to find her, for real, for the first time. I spent entire nights awake, reading the Bible as if it were the first time. And in a way, it was. Words that had previously gone unnoticed now came alive. Verses about humility, about true repentance, about broken hearts, leaped from the pages like an arrow piercing my chest. I cried while reading. I cried because I saw all that I had wasted. I cried because I realized that for years I had been close to the cross but never really reached it. I surrendered to her. There was a passage in the Bible that I had previously read without paying much attention to, but now it struck me like a thunderbolt in my soul. It is in Matthew 7:21-23, where Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name cast out demons and perform many miracles?' Then I will profess to them, 'I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers.'" These words echoed inside me like death knells. I saw myself there, in that crowd of religious people who were devout on the outside but empty on the inside. How many times had I also said, "Lord, Lord"? How many times had I acted right only on the outside without ever truly giving my heart? How many times had I confused devotion with performance? The internal struggle that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. There were times when I wanted to give up, to return to the comfortable ignorance of superficial faith that I had before. It would have been so much easier to just pretend that nothing had changed, to continue with my routine. with my polished image as a good Christian. But every time that temptation arose, the memory of what I saw on the other side would pull me back. The sound of the screams, the empty eyes of pain, the words of the voice that spoke to me. I couldn't go back. Over time, I began to understand that the discomfort burning inside me was not something to be avoided. It was part of the breaking process. It was the pain needed to tear down the altar of my own pride. I finally understood. It wasn't about being perfect or following rules with surgical precision. It was about recognizing my fallibility, my constant need for God's grace, my silent desperation for forgiveness, not just once, but every day. One night, alone in my home office, my eyes glued to the same page of the Bible for nearly an hour, I finally gave in. I fell to my knees, and I cried. They weren't tears of fear or self-pity. They were tears of genuine repentance, a weight that I didn't even know I was carrying falling apart before a God who, even hurt by my indifference, had never abandoned me. At that moment, for the first time, I felt that I was really talking to God. Not a distant God, trapped behind stained glass windows and pulpits, but a present, loving Father waiting for the return of his lost son, of me. That night marked a silent turning point. I was ready to start over. Weeks passed. The near-death experience and the vision of hell had demolished the fragile pillars on which my faith had been built. Now I had to rebuild, not on sand as before, but on the rock of humility and true understanding. This new beginning began with a simple but deeply meaningful gesture. One Sunday morning, instead of going to church as I had done for decades, I took my Bible and went to a park near my home. I sat on a wooden bench, feeling the sun warm my face and the wind caress my neck. I didn't go to run away from faith. I went to find it again. I opened the Bible with trembling hands, not as a duty, but as a hungry man sitting down to a long-awaited meal. And there, in that space between heaven and earth, I read the parable of the prodigal son. I knew it by heart, but now it was my story. For the first time, I saw myself not as the faithful son who stayed at home, but as the one who had departed, not in body, but that Alma. I had wasted years in a decorative faith, in a social Christianity, and now I was returning, humiliated, broken, and accepted. The tears came again, but this time they weren't from pain, they were of relief, of gratitude. For the first time I felt God's love in a real, intimate, undeniable way. From that day on, I began to seek God in the details, in simplicity, in people, in nature, in the words of the Bible that now had flavor and weight. And my prayer changed. Before it was a rehearsed list, almost a formal monologue. Now it was a lively conversation, a chat with the Father. I spoke of doubts, of fear, of gratitude, and then heard, silently, waiting for the answer that sometimes came with words, other times with a peace that simply took care. The changes in me did not go unnoticed. It was one quiet evening after dinner as we sat on the porch that Abigail took my hand and said with a twinkle in her eye, "Ezra, you're different. I can't explain it, but there's a peace in you that I've never seen before." I smiled. I squeezed his hand back. "You're right, Abby. I'm different. I've been through hell, literally. But now, for the first time, I understand what it means to have real faith." I calmly explained to her everything I had discovered, not just on the other side, but within myself, about how I was finally learning to building a relationship with God and not with the idea I had of Him, not based on habits, appearances, or titles, but on humility, on listening, on dependence. And there, on that balcony lit only by the soft light of the moon, my wife cried, but they were good tears. The tears of someone who was seeing something new being born in the man with whom she had shared her entire life. I was starting over, this time, not as an accountant, a husband, or a church member, but like a son who has returned home. Abigail looked at me in silence, her eyes filled with tears. There was a tenderness in her gaze that completely disarmed me. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper, full of emotion. "I'm so happy for you, my love. If this is your new journey, I want to walk beside you every step of the way." Those words echoed inside me. Her support, so sincere and unconditional, had been a foundation throughout the rebuilding process I had been going through. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't trying to find myself alone. We were finding ourselves together. We start changing small things in our daily lives. Instead of just attending church on Sundays as an automatic ritual, We began to seek more authentic ways to live our faith. Little by little, we began to get involved in community actions. Every week, we would get together to prepare meals that we delivered to homeless people. It wasn't out of obligation, nor an attempt to score points with God. It was out of love, a real love, born from looking at the other with empathy and respect. This new perspective also changed the way I related to my children. Before, I thought I had to be an impeccable role model, a Christian example that they should follow without question. But I began to realize that sharing my own doubts, weaknesses, and discoveries created something much more valuable: connection. Our conversations became deeper. We talked about faith, but also about fears, dreams, and the meaning of life. I listened to them with an open heart, and to my surprise, they began to truly listen to me too. At work, the changes didn't go unnoticed. I no longer tried to maintain a polished image of religious perfection. Instead, I began to act with more compassion, seeking to understand each colleague's journey. One day after a meeting, one of my teammates approached me, visibly curious. "Ezra," he said hesitantly, "I don't know what's changed about you, but there's something different. You seem more authentic." He smiled, touched by the observation. "Let's just say I went through something that made me see life with different eyes," I replied. "In fact, I learned that true faith is not in appearing perfect, but in accepting our flaws and still trying to be better every day." As the months passed, I felt my faith growing stronger, but in a whole new way. It was no longer a belief based on absolute certainty or moral superiority. It was a humble, restless, living faith. Our faith that questions, that grows and that reinvents itself. Eventually, I returned to church, not to fulfill an obligation or to be seen, but to be part of an imperfect community, like me, seeking together something bigger than all of us. It was on one of those Sundays after the service that the pastor approached me. He called me aside with a contemplative look. "Ezra," he said, his tone almost fatherly, "I've noticed something different about you lately. There's a depth to your faith that's inspiring. Would you consider sharing your story with the congregation someday?" I hesitated. In my mind flashed the vivid memory of the vision of hell, the tormented faces, the silent screams. I took a deep breath, trying to find courage. "Yes, Pastor," I finally replied. "I think the time has come, not to make myself great, but to show that true faith is born of humility and sincere recognition of our faults." At that moment, I realized that my journey of spiritual reconstruction was not just about me. It was an opportunity to help others avoid making the same mistakes I had made, to show that true Christianity is not about looking flawless, but about a constant search for connection, with God, with others, and with ourselves. I knew this journey was far from over. In fact, I understood that it would be a path with no end point, an ongoing process. But for the first time, I felt like I was on the right path, a path made of authenticity, humility, and genuine love. The transformation I went through after my near-death experience didn't just affect my faith, it reverberated deeply into all my relationships, as if I had gained a new set of eyes. Suddenly, I began to see people more clearly, not as characters in my world, but as complex human beings, full of stories, pain, and hope. The first big impact was on my marriage. In the days following my release from the hospital, Abigail was visibly confused and worried. I oscillated between long, introspective silences and moments of intense emotion. But as I opened up, telling what I experienced, what I saw, and what I felt, something beautiful began to happen between us. Our connection has deepened in ways I never imagined possible. One quiet night, as we lay side by side, she turned her face toward me and asked, with touching vulnerability, "Ezra, do you still love me the same way?" The question caught me off guard. I looked at her, took her hand, and answered with all the sincerity I could muster, "Abby, I love you more than ever. But it's a different love now. It's more conscious, more present. Before, I had said that I loved Abigail because she was my wife, because that was what was expected of me as a husband, as a Christian, as someone who followed rules. But that night, looking into her eyes, I realized that something had changed profoundly. Before, I loved you because it was what I thought I should do, I confessed. Now, I love you because I see you. I really do. I see your strength, your kindness, your quiet courage. I see your struggles, your hidden pains, and I love you not in spite of your imperfections, but because of them, within them. Tears began to stream down Abigail's face, but her smile was brighter than ever. She held my hand tightly, her voice choked with emotion. I felt the difference, and it's like you were finally here, present, for the first time in many years. That presence, that new kind of love, began to manifest itself in subtle and powerful ways. Our conversations became more honest, more vulnerable. I learned to listen without interrupting, to ask questions without judging. I discovered layers of her personality that had previously been hidden, not because she hid them, but because I had never really paid attention. What had been routine became a reunion. Abigail blossomed before my eyes, and I was finally watching. This transformation also had an impact on my relationship with our children, Sarah and Daniel. I had always loved them, but I had been an absent father, even though I was physically present. I was always busy, with work, with church, with everything but them. Now I committed to being truly there, with an open heart. I began to listen to their fears, their dreams, their frustrations, and most importantly, I stopped trying to mold them into my image. One afternoon, my 17-year-old son Daniel approached with a nervous expression. "Father," he said hesitantly, I don't think I believe in God." In the past, these words would have shocked me. I would have responded with rebuke, trying to correct his faith with verses and arguments. But in that moment, I just took a deep breath. "Thank you for telling me that, son. Would you like to tell me what made you think that?" What followed was one of the deepest and most honest conversations I have ever had. Daniel talked about his doubts, his disappointments with the church, his discomfort with certain religious stances. I listened. I asked questions. I also shared my own uncertainties, the shadows of my journey, the pain that led me to change. When we finished, he hugged me, his eyes welling up with tears. "Thank you, Dad. I was so afraid of disappointing you." "You would never let me down by being honest," I replied. "Your journey is yours. My role is to love you and walk beside you, not to control your steps." This new way of seeing and living went beyond the walls of my home. At church, I began to see people in a new light. Before, without even realizing it, I had categorized them: the good Christians, the strays, the lost. Now I saw human beings, each one fighting their own silent war, each one carrying scars that no one else sees. I became involved in support and counseling ministries, not to preach or correct, but to listen, to be present. In one such session, a woman said to me, moved, "Ezra, when I came to you, I thought I would hear sermons, judgments, but you just listened to me, and you offered me compassion. That's how I imagined Jesus would treat people." I was silent for a moment, touched, because in that moment I realized that perhaps finally I was beginning to live what I preached so much, to love as Christ loved. At work, the impact was also evident. Before, without even realizing it, I had exuded a certain moral superiority. Now I treated every co-worker with genuine respect, regardless of their faith or lifestyle. One day, John, an openly atheist co-worker, called me in for a chat. "Ezra," he said, scratching his head as if he didn't know how to begin, "look, I never thought I'd say this, but you changed my view of Christians. You don't try to convert me, you don't judge me, but your way of living, that really makes me think." He smiled, touched to the soul. "Thank you, John. I learned that true testimony is not in what we say, but in how we live, and it's true." As time went on, I realized that my near-death experience had done much more than reconnect me with God. It had completely transformed the way I saw and related to the world around me. Every person had value, real, non-negotiable. I began to see the beauty and pain in every face, as if I had finally gained color vision after a lifetime of seeing in black and white. And now, finally, I could see all the colors of the world, as if I had stepped from a gray world into a vibrant, life-giving canvas. As the months passed since my near-death experience, I felt like I was truly moving forward on my spiritual journey. My faith was no longer a set of memorized words. It had become something deep, sincere, and above all, authentic. My relationships were stronger, and I felt an inner peace I had never known before. But there was something I hadn't yet faced head-on: my past. One quiet Sunday afternoon, as I was flipping through an old photo album with Abigail, one image in particular stopped me in my tracks for a few seconds. It was a photo of a church barbecue taken about 5 years ago. In the image, I was smiling, surrounded by members of the congregation looking like the perfect Christian leader, sure, confident, full of self-assurance. But looking at that photo at that moment, all I felt was shame and deep regret. "Abby?" My voice came out shaky, almost a whisper. Looking at this picture, all I see is hypocrisy. I smiled and acted like I had all the answers, but inside I was empty. Abigail placed her hand on my shoulder, her eyes brimming with understanding. "Ezra, you can't change the past," she said with a gentleness that comforted me. "The important thing is that you recognize it now and are doing your best to be a better person." Her words were encouraging, but I knew that it wasn't enough to just acknowledge my mistakes to myself. If I really wanted to live a true life, with humility and authenticity, I needed to face my past directly, without running away. The following week, I scheduled a meeting with Pastor David, the leader of our church. Sitting in his office, my heart racing, I began to speak. "Pastor, I need to confess something. For years, I have been in leadership positions here. I gave advice, I judged people, but now I realize I was living a lie. My faith was shallow, based more on pride than on true love for God and my neighbor." Pastor David listened to me quietly, his eyes kind and attentive. When I finished, he leaned forward in his chair and said, "Ezra, what you are describing is a struggle that many of us face, even if few have the courage to admit it. Your honesty is admirable. But what do you think we should do now?" I took a deep breath and replied, "I think I need to ask for forgiveness, not only from God, but from the congregation. I want to share my story, not to exalt myself, but to warn others about the dangers of spiritual pride." The shepherd nodded slowly. "This takes a lot of courage, Ezra. Are you sure you're ready for this?" "Honestly, Pastor, I'm terrified, but I know it's right." Over the next few weeks, I worked with him to prepare my testimony. We decided that I would speak on a special Sunday, dedicated to repentance and spiritual renewal. When the day arrived, I stepped up to the pulpit with shaking legs. I looked around at the congregation. Familiar faces, friends, brothers and sisters I had surrounded myself with for years, and felt the weight of what I was about to do. "Brothers and sisters," I began, my voice wavering but gaining firmness as I went on, "I am not here to preach today. I am here to confess and ask for forgiveness." I paused, took a deep breath and continued. "For many years you have seen me as an example of Christian faith. I have held leadership positions, given advice, and judged those around me. But today I must admit that all of that was a lie." A murmur ran through the congregation, and I noticed faces filled with surprise, confusion, and even concern. Still, I knew I had to continue. "A few months ago, I had a near-death experience," I said, my heart racing. "In that experience, God showed me how shallow and empty my faith was. I was filled with spiritual pride, believing that I was better than others just because I followed rules and participated in church activities. Then I shared with them the vision of hell that I had seen, the tormented souls, the despairing faces, including those of those who, like me, thought they were saved by their outward religiosity. I described the horror of realizing how close I was to that dark fate. "I am here today," I began, my voice trembling and full of emotion, "to ask for forgiveness. Forgiveness to God for having distorted his message of love, transforming it into a display of false piety, and forgiveness to all of you for having been an example of hypocrisy when you should have lived an authentic and true faith." I looked at the faces in front of me. Some were crying silently, others were shocked. There were also those who showed doubt, and even a certain incomprehension. "I'm not here to set myself up as a new example to be followed," I clarified, feeling the weight of each word. "I'm here as a warning about the dangers of spiritual pride, superficial faith, and judging others. I want to tell you that true Christianity is not about appearing perfect, but about recognizing our imperfections and seeking, with an open heart, transformation through God's love." When I finished speaking, silence fell over the place. It was a heavy silence, full of expectation. After a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, people began to move, not to leave as I had feared, but to approach the altar. The first to arrive was John, a man I had always silently judged for his struggle with alcoholism. He hugged me tightly, tears streaming down his face, and said, "Thank you, Ezra. That meant a lot to me too." After him, a flood of people followed suit. Some came to share their own struggles with spiritual pride and hypocrisy. Others simply came to offer forgiveness and support. One young woman came up to me, overcome with emotion, and told me that my testimony had made her feel, for the first time, that she could be accepted in the church despite all her mistakes. At that moment, Pastor David came over and put his hand on my shoulder. His voice was choked. "What you did today, Ezra, is true Christianity. Vulnerability, honesty, genuine repentance. You have opened the door for spiritual renewal in our church. In the days and weeks that followed, I noticed a profound change in the atmosphere of the congregation. People were more open, willing to share their doubts and struggles. Judgment gave way to compassion, and spiritual competition to solidarity. But this transformation wasn't limited to church. At home, my openness opened the door for deeper conversations with Abigail and our children. At work, colleagues who had previously seen me as unapproachable because of my perfect Christian stance now felt comfortable sharing their own challenges and seeking advice. One time, while walking in the park, I met Maria, a former church member who had left years ago. "Ezra," she said with a shy smile, "I heard your testimony. It made me want to give the church another chance." I smiled, feeling a mixture of humility and gratitude. "Mary," I replied, "the church is not a place for perfect people. It is a hospital for sinners like the rest of us. I learned that the hard way, and now I know that it is precisely in our imperfection that we find God's true grace." As the months passed, I continued on my journey of self-discovery and spiritual growth. There were some difficult moments, of course. Some people walked away, unable to handle this new atmosphere of vulnerability. Others questioned whether I should still be in leadership positions. But for every challenge, there was a quiet victory, a new opportunity to learn and evolve. By admitting my faults and seeking forgiveness, not only from God, but from those around me, I found a peace and authenticity that I had never experienced in all the years of false piety. I finally understood that true Christian witness is not about displaying perfection, but about showing the transforming power of God's love and grace in our imperfect lives. And that, without a doubt, is the most powerful message we can offer the world.